Hello, my name is Michael Lambert, and today I want to talk about two quite historic events that took place last week on Wednesday and Thursday. One was a speech by Rishi Sunak, and the other was a speech by Keir Starmer, both setting out their ideas and aspirations for the coming year and for the future. Of the two speeches, Starmer's was really quite a good speech and had a lot of good content. On the other hand, Sunak's speech was it was just a lot of vacuous nonsense. I think they must have written it in the taxi on the way to the event, because it was just. Well, I'm going to read you some excerpts in a moment. Rishi Sunak, he's like the head boy, isn't he? He's like the school swot, the guy who wins all the prizes for maths and so on. He's very keen and I'm sure he's very clever and so on. But somehow or other, he's not. He comes across as being a caretaker prime minister. You just think, he's just holding the fort. He's steady Eddie for the time being until somebody else takes over. And his speech was, it was just a lot of hot air. I mean, it was 19 pages of drivel. But what I do want to talk about also today is about any clues that these two speeches might give us about the attitudes of both the Conservatives and Labour to Brexit, the all-important Brexit, which is causing us so much trouble and strife at the moment. So let me first begin by talking about Sunak's speech. He began as follows: New Year should be a time of optimism and excitement. Yet I know many of you look ahead to 2023 with apprehension. I want you to know that as your Prime Minister, I will work night and day to change that, and quickly. Not just by providing relief and peace of mind for the months to come, although we will, but also by changing our country and building a better future for our children and grandchildren. A future that restores optimism, hope and pride in Britain. You see, he wants change, and you'll hear in a moment Starmer wants change as well. They all want to change. They've been in power for 13 years, but they want to change everything because things aren't really quite how they should be. He goes on pointing out that the cost of living is too high, waiting lists in the NHS are too long, and illegal migration is far too much. So he says he wants to make 5 promises, and he makes 5 pledges, and they're as follows. First, he's going to halve inflation. Well, all the world and his wife knows that just about all forecasters of any note or authority are forecasting that inflation is going to come down substantially this next year. So that's really not much of it's just telling us what's going to happen. Second, we will grow the economy, creating better paid jobs and opportunity right across the country. No indication in the speech as to how he's going to do that. He might just say, I'm going to make everybody happier. It's just meaningless. Third, we'll make sure our national debt is falling so that we can secure the future of public services. Well, that depends upon growing the economy, and he's got no indication of how, and gives no indication of how he's going to grow the economy. Fourth, NHS waiting lists will fall and people will get the care they need more quickly. How's he going to do that? Fifth, we will pass new laws to stop small boats, making sure that if you come to this country illegally, you are detained and swiftly removed. You see, that's the big one. These little boats are what are really keeping our economy, just wrecking our economy, these small boats coming. There's a guy called Andrew Bowie, and he has the unfortunate task of being the Secretary of State for Exports. He was asked on Newsnight the same night. He said, about this pledge about stopping the small boats. He said, how are you going to do that? And he said, well, our aim is to break the business model of the people smugglers. Now, I talked about this last week. It's a bit like breaking the business model of the drug smugglers. You cannot do it unless you give free drugs to everybody. You're not going to break the model. And he then said, well, how are you going to do it? He says, well, if they come to the UK, I'm quoting verbatim now, if they come to the UK illegally, they will be sent back from whence they came. Can't do that. Not allowed to. We could do when we're in the EU. We can't do it now. You can't send them back to France. Or Rwanda. Now, Rwanda said they can take 200 people. It cost, I think, £700,000 each person. And there were 40,000 People came across the channel last year in little boats, didn't they? And then he says, this is having made it illegal to come across the channel in boats, or they may achieve asylum status and will be allowed to remain. Just so ridiculous. And so he goes on talking about we need to change the way our country works. That requires a change in mindset. What does that mean in practice? It means more innovative economies, stronger communities, a world class. Why does he bother? I mean, why go all the way to the East End, waste all that petrol to deliver this drivel? It's just nonsense. A better future is one where our economy is growing faster, so that everybody everywhere across our union has new opportunities for better paying good jobs. He's had 13 years for that. And he says, it's a big risk for a politician to say that. He wants to spread the culture of creative thinking. I mean, I'll not detain you with too much of this drivel, because it is drivel. But he says that all this stuff he's going to do, it's going to make our country a beacon of science, technology and enterprise, and it will lift our productivity, raise our growth rate, create jobs in the decades to come. And goes on about innovation a lot, which is fine. We need to innovate, but it's not something the government really can do very much about. And so right now, the most powerful way to achieve higher growth is to make sure the UK is the most innovative economy in the world. He goes on about what they're achieving with things like the police. They're going to have another, by this spring, that's 3 months' time, we're going to have 20,000 extra police officers. And then he goes on about he wants everyone to study maths until they're 18. I did maths in school. I learnt arithmetic, and I learnt algebra, I learnt geometry, and I learnt trigonometry. And now, all these years on, I have no idea what trigonometry is. I don't believe I've used algebra since the day I left school. And geometry, well, it's nice to know about angles and things and so on, but I think to study maths generally and to the age of 18 is probably, if you're a maths nerd and somebody who probably does maths puzzles as a hobby, it might well be a good thing, but I think for everybody else it's probably not the priority he seems to think it is. It's very important. People should learn arithmetic, but I think there are much more important things like how society works and how government works and so on, that providing you can somehow maintain the education above boredom level, probably more important than teaching maths to 18. And then he says, regarding the health service, he says, we've significantly increased funding for health and social care. We've recruited thousands more doctors and nurses, and we've upgraded more hospitals with cutting-edge technology. If he's done all this, how come there's this massive crisis in the NHS now? How come it's practically collapsing? Oh, I know, it's Putin, isn't it? And COVID, and it's the last Labour government. And then he says, our vision of change will revitalise every aspect of our lives, every aspect. Better jobs, stronger communities, world-class education, and NHS built around patients. And in this whole 19 pages, not a word about climate change, not a word. Not a word about artificial intelligence, how that's changing all our lives, not a word. Not a word about the fact that we're an ageing population and that we're going to be very short of workers. No, that's can't mention that because it might involve immigration. And in this 19 pages, he mentions Brexit just once, one sentence. And this is what he says. Seizing the opportunities of Brexit to ensure our regulatory system is agile and pro-innovation. So Brexit, which is causing the collapse of the economy, is all about ensuring our regulatory system is agile. I want to say a bit about Brexit. That's what motivated me to start making these videos and so on. And I just want to repeat an analogy which I told you about some time ago. And just imagine this. Look, supposing the county of Yorkshire, they said, someone went around saying, we should have control over our own affairs. We don't want faceless bureaucrats making our laws. We don't want other people making our laws. We want to make our own laws. We want to be free. And supposing they had a referendum and they decided, yes, they wanted their own independence, they wanted sovereignty. And so Yorkshire became an independent sovereign state. And immediately borders were put up right around the county, so that any goods moving in or moving out had to go through procedures which involved form filling, import-export documentation, involved certificates of phytosanitary and veterinary certificates of origin, all which cost a lot of money and took time and so on. And supposedly at the same time, the county of Yorkshire said, well, we don't want people who weren't born in Yorkshire working in here. So if you're already working here, well, that's okay. You can apply for permission to stay. But if you're not, we don't let anybody else in to come and work here. And so a lot of people started moving away and so on. So they then had a shortage of workers. And so anybody, for example, a manufacturer in Yorkshire, maybe he's making wheelbarrows, maybe he buys the metal for his wheelbarrows, maybe buys that in Birmingham, and maybe buys the wheels from a guy in Lancashire who imports them from China. So when he buys his metal from Birmingham, he's got to fill in lots of forms and import documents, and the manufacturer in Birmingham has to do the same. And when he buys the wheels from the guy in Lancashire, well, the guy gets them from China, so they need a certificate of origin showing where they came from, and when they're all eventually get through all this bureaucracy, they arrive at the factory and they're put together again. Then he wants to export his wheelbarrows to Lancashire or something, and then he has to start filling out forms, export forms, and so on. And not only that, his customer in Lancashire also has to start filling out forms, and he might have to pay duty and VAT when the goods arrive in Lancashire before he can get hold of them. And anybody living in Yorkshire who wants to buy goods on the internet, for example, from anywhere else in England or in the UK, would find they have to start filling in forms and very often paying duties and so on. Now, what would be the effect of that? I mean, businesses in Yorkshire would find it very, very difficult, because people all over the UK would say, don't bother with Yorkshire, it's too difficult, it's too complicated. And this is all so obvious. What would happen, of course, is that the Yorkshire economy would start to decline. And as it declined, business would start going bust, and they'd start paying less tax, and there'd be more unemployed people, and businesses going bust would drag down other businesses, and you'd get this steady decline. And this is exactly what is happening. This is Brexit. We have handicapped ourselves so much by being behind a bureaucratic wall which is almost impenetrable. And as I've said many, many times before, and as many other people have been saying, it's now practically impossible for small or medium-sized firms to export to the EU. It's just too much trouble, not only for the supplier in the UK, but for customers in the EU. They don't want to be bothered. And so we've got the Conservatives who don't want to talk about Brexit. They don't want to mention it. They're not mentioning now about global Britain, about all the trade triumphs. I mean, this is his keynote speech. Sunak's keynote speech doesn't mention anything about that. And he just talks about you want to make sure that our regulation and regulatory regime is agile. Labour Party, they don't want to mention it because Starmer has rather foolishly said he's going to make it work. Can you imagine? in that situation I've just described in that analogy in Yorkshire, saying you're going to make it work. I mean, how are you going to make it work? There's a guy, Thomas Symonds, who's the Secretary of State for Trade for Wales. He was asked how Labour are going to make Brexit work, and he said, well, they'd try and renegotiate agreements about phytosanitary certificates and veterinary certificates. Well, that'll make no difference. That'll make no difference. Tiny difference. It's just this mass of bureaucracy we cannot avoid. Now, I think in Starmer's speech, there's just a tiny clue that he's beginning to see the light, because his line has been all along that, it hasn't been his line, but it's been assumed that he's wanted to make sure he doesn't upset the red wall voters who he's so desperate to keep. And I think he must be beginning to realise now that a lot of them are seeing the light as well. And I think with the just avalanche, the tsunami of bad news, bad economic news that we've had over the last few months, showing how desperately serious the effects of negative effects of Brexit are, must be having some effect. And as I say, I think in his speech he gives us a clue. So let me just tell you a little bit about what he had to say in his speech. His speech was much smaller. His was 13 pages, and he gave a whole paragraph to Brexit, three sentences. But I thought that, by and large, his speech was very good. I thought he had a lot of good stuff in it. I think stuff like he particularly wants to decentralise. He says Westminster has too much power, and he wants to devolve a lot of that power to local governments and communities and so on. I think that's all excellent. But he did at the same time, and I've made a mockery of some of what Sunak had to say, and I think Starmer also came up, or his speechwriters came up with some sort of nonsense. He starts off, we must look forward with hope, but for hope to flourish, Britain needs change. You see, it's again change. Everybody's going to change, isn't it? Every prime minister, every leader of the opposition, they want change. If they got it right, they wouldn't have to change it. Mind you, he's not responsible. Starmer's not responsible for all the mess we're in at the moment. So he says, and it's in our communities, in towns and cities like Burnley, Wolverhampton, Grimsby and Swindon, not places like Tunbridge Wells and Cheltenham and Bath and places like that. No, Burnley, Wolverhampton, Grimsby and Swindon, where the people will tell you in no uncertain terms, they're absolutely unequivocal, that they have ambition for themselves and their communities. You see? You want to realise that people in Burnley have ambition. Wolverhampton. What they lack is a government that shares their ambition. Government could care less. And he does mention, he mentions the challenges we face on climate change, artificial intelligence, caring for an ageing society, and so at least those very, very important priorities he's aware of. And he goes on to criticise the Westminster system, how the centralisation is too much centralisation and so on. And he's quite cleverly nicked the take back control. I mean, whereas take back control for the Conservatives meant taking back control from the evil Brussels. I mean, he's talking about local authorities taking back control, local communities taking back control, which is good, which is excellent. So all in all, I think it was quite a decent speech. But when it came to Brexit, let me tell you what he said, because I think this is quite interesting. He says, I go back to Brexit. Yes, a whole host of issues were on that ballot paper. There weren't. It was leave or remain. There was one issue that was on the ballot paper. It is absolutely true that one decision represented a whole host of issues. Certainly an infinite number of issues were involved in that decision, but it was really just an in-out. But as I went around the country campaigning for Remain, I couldn't disagree with the basic case so many Leavers made to me. So what he's saying is that I was in favour of Remain, but I agreed with what the Leave voters were saying. Classic sort of fence-sitting, really, isn't it? But I do think that may be just a tiny indication of an approaching U-turn. And as I said before, I think maybe he does begin to realise that there are lots and lots and lots and lots of people who are not going to vote for him if he goes on talking about making a success of Brexit. There is only, as I've said many times before, there's only one way we're ever going to recover, and that is by getting closer to Europe. And it might even mean going back cap in hand, but we are sooner or later going to have to go back to Europe and try and negotiate some better arrangement than what we have at the moment, which is absolutely disastrous. Anyhow, that's what I think about it. If you watched this far, thank you very much. If you haven't already subscribed and you wouldn't mind doing so, I would much appreciate it. And so until next time, thank you for watching and bye for now.